And again, good afternoon to all of you, and welcome to Historic Fort Steilacoom's lecture series. Before I introduce our speaker today, I wanted to take just a moment to say thank you for coming in and listening to our presentation. Your participation in our programs is really, what keeps us going. And certainly we have a number of those of you that are members. So we want to say a special thank you to our members that are joining us today. If you're not currently a member of Historic Fort Steilacoom Association, we invite you to visit our website, historicfortsteilacoom.org, and become a member today. That would make our membership chair, John McPherson, who is with us today, very happy. But yes, thank you to those of you that are tuning in for the presentation today. I'd like to introduce our speaker, who you've all come to hear. Today we have the pleasure of listening to Mike Vouri speak to us on the Pig War of 1859 in Washington Territory. And long before the San Juan Islands were a vacation destination, they were the focus of an international crisis ignited by an unlikely incident, the shooting of a pig in a potato patch. And this was the famous Pig War of 1859, when military and naval forces of the United States and Great Britain almost came to blows in midsummer after the death of the Berkshire boar. In the end, not a single shot was fired by opposing forces. The nations opted for peace, an outcome commemorated more than 100 years later with the creation of San Juan Island National Historical Park. Mr. Vouri is the author of 5 books about national, state, and regional history, including The Pig War, Standoff at Griffin Bay, which I highly recommend to you all. Prior to his 21-year stint as Chief of Interpretation and Historian at San Juan Island National Historical Park, he retired in 2015. Vouri was a public affairs officer, history curator for the Whatcom Museum of History and Art, a reporter for the Bellingham Herald, and an assistant director for the Washington State Department of Veterans Affairs. He currently is a group leader and lecturer for the Skagit Valley College Road Scholar Program. And we are so very excited to have you come and speak to us today. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Mr. Vouri. Take it away.
Thank you. Well, welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us on this beautiful Sunday in June. In 2 days from now, it'll be June 15th, I hope. And June 15th, of course, is the day that Lyman Cutler shot a pig belonging to the Hudson's Bay Company, which kicked off the whole pig war thing. And just recently, HistoryLink, which I know a lot of you look at, historylink.org, has written a review piece, posted a review piece on the Pig War, and you can go to the links and read some of the really fine histories that have been contributed by some of the HistoryLink writers. I've sort of written around it on HistoryLink because when I was writing for HistoryLink, I was still employed by the National Park Service, and there was a whole thing where you can't get paid twice for doing your job. So I deferred to Kit Oldham, who wrote a very fine history of the Pig War. You'll find it on historylink.com. And also my colleague here on San Juan Island, Lynn Rushvarg, has written a couple of pieces related to the Pig War that are quite excellent. And I highly recommend those. And then Gene Godden recently posted a piece on, I think it's called the Post Alley website. Gene Godden's a retired columnist for the Seattle Post-Intelligencer and the Seattle Times. She wrote it. And of course, if you want to read about the Pig War in depth, you can read my books, The Pig War Standoff at Griffin Bay, which is published by University of Washington Press and Discovery Year Northwest. And also there's a book called Outpost of Empire, which is about the joint occupation of San Juan Island after the pig war, which I will get into in just a second. You see the hat I'm wearing? Yes, I'm a native of the San Francisco Bay Area and a lifelong Giants fan, and they are playing just great right now. But you didn't come to hear about baseball. You came to hear about the pig war. Does everybody see this? And you can see the title, The Pig War, Who Ate the Pig? Now, I bring this up because in my 21 years working in the National Historical Park, I could count on hearing this question almost every day. And usually somebody telling a joke that, and I'd say, oh, yes, sir, very original. I've never heard that one before. But who ate the pig? And this gives me the entree-vous to say that this particular event was about much more than a pig being shot. There was a lot on the table between the United States and Great Britain. And that's what this was all about. One of the things that I used to tell visitors to the park was that individuals and nations can sometimes resolve their problems peacefully without resorting to violence. And that's what happened here on San Juan Island in the red hot summer of 1859. People chose diplomacy over shooting, and the wonderful relationship that we've maintained with the United Kingdom of Great Britain has been sustained from that date on. In fact, I was reading the New York Times today and was looking at photographs of Queen Elizabeth with our President Joe Biden and Dr. Biden, his wife, celebrating in Windsor Castle, and Dr. Biden and the Duchess of Cambridge in a school with English children. And all of that stems from the legacy that was affirmed during the summer of 1859. So the first slide I'm going to put up here for you, and I don't know why that little blue line is on there, try to ignore it. This is the Strait of Juan de Fuca. This map dates back to the Spanish. Everything begins with maps. And this is the map that I like to show. It was done in 1790 on a voyage of Manuel Quimper, who was a Spanish captain, and with his navigator Jose Narvaez and Juan Pantoja and Gonzalo Lopez de Haro, blazing up the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And you can see the map is somewhat unclear, only because it shows where they didn't go. And of course, these were their ships, the Santa Saturnina, the San Carlos, the Santa Saturnina, the boat on the left, was from one of the first conflicts that was resolved peacefully, and that was the Nootka controversy in 1790 in Nootka Sound on the west coast of Vancouver Island. The little vessel that you see on the left-hand side was actually an English vessel. I know I'm trying to remove that blue line, but I'm unfortunately I can't. And I hope you'll apologize. I had enough technical difficulties getting this thing up as it was. If any of you have any suggestions on how I could get rid of it, I would welcome them, but I can't. So you'll have to bear with me. Hello? Did somebody have a suggestion? Okay, let's press on. I don't somehow. Let's see. Now I've really messed up, and Okay, let's just leave it the way it is. And now I've really screwed up. Okay. So yeah, I'm gonna have to get myself together again. So this is HMS Discovery. These were the vessels of George Vancouver. Let's get right down to why there was this mess to begin with. Vancouver actually didn't enter the islands himself. His second in command, William Broughton, and HMS Chatham blazed. And actually, as you can see from this particular creation, I'm going to widen it just a little bit. This was the first time that the San Juan Islands were actually delineated as separate islands. And one of the things the British always talked about when they argued about which channel was the proper international boundary, the Haro Strait on the left or the Rosario Strait on the right. One of the arguments of the British was following the track of George Vancouver, which would have been on Rosario Strait. So this was one of the first maps, and it was one that was referred to by the British at the height of the controversy. After George Vancouver, the next person that explored the San Juan Islands was for the United States, and that was Charles Wilkes as part of the United States exploring expedition. Wilkes passed through in 1841 and named all the islands for War of 1812 naval battles, heroes, and ships, and also for British ships that happened to have been captured or sunk by the Americans. And of course, many of those names were flushed, and a few managed to stay. This is the map that was pretty much in place in 1859. And this was a map that was assembled through the efforts of the British Hydrographic Office, the United States Coast Survey, and this one happened to be published in Germany, but is fairly accurate to the time. There's one thing that I need to point out on this map that's kind of fun, and that is this particular channel, which I've expanded right now, is now called President's Channel. At the time this map was made, they were still clinging to the idea that it ought to be Douglas Channel, named for the provincial governor, James Douglas, who was also the chief factor of the Hudson's Bay Company. So let's get down to the nitty gritty of what the Pig War was all about. Following the War of 1812, the United States and Great Britain in 1818 cleared the last remaining issues of the peace treaty by agreeing to a joint exploration and occupation of the Oregon country. The area today comprises the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, portions of Wyoming and Montana, west of the Continental Divide, and the provinces of British Columbia. As with the Nootka Convention in 1790, the one I mentioned, the first that was settled peacefully, this treaty stipulated that possession of the regions would be determined by effective occupation. That is, the nation that established effective commerce and settlement would have the strongest claim. And this is essentially the Oregon country that the British and the Americans were talking about. As you can see, it does in fact include the province of British Columbia, the states of Washington, Oregon, Idaho, and portions of Montana and Wyoming west of the Continental Divide. And this was the land that the British and the Americans decided that they were going to divide. Now you can see right here is the 49th parallel. That's what they agreed upon finally in 1846. There was quite a bit of fractiousness going on before this was decided. At one particular point, the British sent a warship, crossed over the bar on the Columbia River, and sailed up just to affirm the fact that the British weren't going to be pushed around, but they eventually compromised and they settled on the 49th. Now, the British at first said, you know what you ought to do is you ought to take that boundary and run it down up Puget Sound, as they would have said in those days, and let us have the Olympic Peninsula and the tip of Vancouver Island. The Americans said no, they stood fast on it. They said, you can keep all of Vancouver Island. We will take the Olympic Peninsula and all of the lands to the south, and we will do a water boundary. And here is what the contention was all about after the Treaty of 1846. The treaty language read that the boundary would go along the 49th parallel to the middle of the Strait of Georgia. And then the treaty language read, thus through the southerly channel that divides Vancouver Island from the mainland. But as you can see, the San Juan archipelago is right smack dab in the middle. So one of the things when I was a park ranger, one of the things I used to tell the kids, we always have a little fun on this. The British would say, well, anyone can plainly see that it is Rosario Straits. You Americans can just go away. And the Americans would say, why don't y'all talk United States talk, for crying out loud? Anyone can see it's the Harris Strait. You skedaddle on out of here. So what they agreed to do was hold the whole question in abeyance. This was in June of 1846. And they would hold the islands in dispute until they could decide on which channel was the boundary. The British immediately said, well, let's get surveyors out and let's do it. The United States Congress refused to appropriate any funds for any such survey. And so over the next 13 years, there was trouble. So let's move on. So the presence of Great Britain was manifest by the Hudson's Bay Company, which in 1849 had been given the charter to colonize Vancouver Island. That was a pretty unusual step for the Hudson's Bay Company. They weren't exactly in the colony business. And this is a wonderful painting of the fort that was done by James Madison Alden, who was the nephew of James Alden, who was the captain of the United States Coast Survey steamer Active. And when they had passed through in 1854, he recorded this splendid view of the post. Established by Chief Factor James Douglas of the Hudson's Bay Company, Fort Victoria was the gathering place for British and American settlers and native peoples alike. They came to purchase supplies, swap news, make friends, sometimes settle scores, and later catch steamers to San Francisco or up Puget Sound. And this is a picture, the photo on the left is a picture of one of the bastions at Fort Victoria, founded 1845, really solidified by 1846, right around the time of the Oregon Treaty, and continued to grow and strengthen. Very much a fort that not only supported the fur trade, but a very large agricultural establishment on the tip of Vancouver Island. And here is one of my favorite photos. This is a splendid photo that showed up in a photo album at Yale University. It's part of the Beinecke collection. I believe there's also a copy of it in the Library of Congress, but this is an actual photograph of Fort Victoria very early on in its history. When I first saw this particular thing in the photograph, I thought, my gosh, that looks like a house trailer. Ha ha. You can see the bastion. All the way over here, you can see a vessel that's tied up. There are some iron rings here that still exist. In fact, the only thing that's left of Fort Victoria in the modern city of Victoria are these iron rings on which they lashed first the company steamer, the Beaver, and then the Otter. And when you go to Victoria, if you walk down onto Wharf Street and go by the old brick customs house, there's a little walkway. You can go out onto the customs house and you can see those iron rings. And if you want, you can even go down there into the rocks where they were drilled into, and you can grab onto one and grab onto a piece of history. So the Hudson's Bay Company, when after the treaty was Oregon was signed, Douglas had been given directions by his government to ensure that the San Juan Islands were British. Douglas was to colonize the islands. Now, this was in contravention of the agreement between the two nations. The islands were to be held in dispute, but it was believed that they needed to establish, or the British government told Douglas that he needed to establish a colony there. Well, he looked around, and remember, I said the Hudson's Bay Company was not in the colony business. He didn't have anybody to send over there to start a farm, so he sent over a contingent from the Hudson's Bay Company. They have actually established a corporate farm. Now, those of you that live in the Puget Sound are familiar with Fort Nisqually and familiar with Fort Vancouver to the south on the Columbia River know that the agricultural enterprises that were conducted by the company down there were part of the Puget Sound Agricultural Company. Up here on San Juan Island, the farm was established with such alacrity that it was not part of the agricultural company. It just stood apart. He sent over a guy by the name of Charles John Griffin, who was a servant of the company. All employees were referred to as servants. I feel a little reticent about talking about the Hudson's Bay Company, knowing that Karen and Patrick are listening in. They're the true experts. If you have any questions about that, be sure to ask them afterwards. I do my best. Now, they established the prairie. Somebody had problems with spelling. This was George Richards. He was a Royal Navy officer, a great surveyor. This was a survey that he had done of the islands later in the 1850s. And you can see where they established the Hudson's Bay Company farm, Bellevue Sheep Farm. And I really love this particular map because some of the details are still fairly, still very much apply to the coast. Here you can see this is one of the only sandy beaches on San Juan Island, and that's at Grandma's Cove. And you can see here that the Hudson's Bay Company called it a landing place. Now, the main landing place was on the other side. You can see their dock. This was on Griffin Bay. So they constructed this pier on Griffin Bay. My guess is the sheep were landed here. They had 1,069 head of sheep onto the island on December 15th, 1853, right at the end of the year. Actually, my birthday. I don't know if they were observing it or yet. But you can see here that they had a large Indian contingent when they first landed on the island. The Indians were actually, we would refer to them if they are Canadian First Nations people. That would be the Cowichan and the Songhees. The Cowichan, the Songhees, with some help from the Skagits and others, cut a sheep run up the north end of the island. And this is a splendid view of Bellevue Sheep Farm. And this was a photograph that was taken at the height of the pig war crisis in 1853. Very classic this was Charles Griffin, who was the chief agent, who was eventually upgraded to factor. The men's living quarters in this particular building. There's an English pass-through barn at the back, and look at the logs that are form the sheep pens. So I wrote here a lot of these quotes on this particular PowerPoint are from my book. I write, hoping to blunt American ambitions by again establishing prior claim and effective occupation on San Juan Island. James Douglas, now the colonial governor as well as chief factor, that started in 1849, held 2 jobs, launched Bellevue Sheep Farm on the southern end of the island. And of course, they describe it on the banks of a rivulet in the center of a dry elevated sheep run containing about 1,500 acres of prairie land. And besides the large the land yields excess and will support from 2,000 to 3,000 head of sheep. And then they talk about what they brought over, and that was 1,369 sheep, as well as 1 horse, 1 stallion evidently considered different from a horse, 1 mare, 2 cows and calves, 1 heifer, 1 boar, and one sow with young. I don't know if that boar was the boar in question. This is a wonderful painting. It sort of captures Bellevue Sheep Farm in action, called Bellevue, of course, because you can see the Olympic Mountains in the background. Here's the beaver. This painting was done by Richard Schlecht, who is a illustrator for National Geographic, the Smithsonian Magazine. Many murals in national parks have been done by Richard, and he did 5 paintings for us, including this one. And you can see pretty much all the buildings I described or showed in this particular photograph. Richard was operating off of these, and he sort of put everything in perspective. And there's some other wonderful things about this. When the painting was done, a bunch of the guys from Harper's Ferry, from the media center from the National Park Service, came out, and they said, "Who did your artwork, Mike?" And I said, "Well, it was Richard." And they said, "Richard? Uh-oh, you're gonna have to watch out for Richard." And I said, "What do you mean?" And they said, "Well, Richard puts little things into his paintings." I said, "What kind of little things?" I said, "Well, how about this? Here is a guy taking a potty break in the middle of his workday." But the wonderful Seattle poet, Paul Nelson, came up, and I told Paul the story, getting ready to point out this fellow right here. And Paul instead said, "Oh, look what this dog's doing right here." So anyway, there you go. There's some rich daily life. So almost immediately, more pasture got and developed for sheep operations, until virtually the entire 55 square mile island was dotted with sheep pasturage. The Cowichan First Nations people, along with the Songhees and the Skagit, cut a sheep run north up the island under the supervision of the governor himself, who knew a thing or two about building roads and came over and supervised it. The other grazing areas were called Mountain Prairie, Winter Station, New Station, and each of these areas housed a shepherd, a log house, and a corral or park. So, boy, I tell you, and here's Charles John Griffin himself, born in Montreal of English-speaking parents. Montreal, as Karen and Patrick will tell you, had been the headquarters for the Northwest Company until it had been absorbed by the Hudson's Bay Company in 1821. So my guess is Charles' father was probably an employee of the old Northwest Company, and he was part of that culture. Anyway, a lot of the features that Griffin named on San Juan Island were French names. For example, we have a housing development on the island called Portland Fair. Portland, like Portland, Oregon. It was actually spelled P-O-R-T, capital L, apostrophe capital ENFER, l'enfer, meaning hellgate. They drove the sheep right through there. So there was a sheep incident, which I call the San Juan Sheep War. It took place at the tail end of 1855, 1856, wherein the county officials in Whatcom County really felt that the San Juan Islands belonged to them, and that any sheep that were being run by the Hudson's Bay Company were property that need to be taxed. And the Americans came over to collect tax from Charles Griffin. Griffin, of course, refused to pay. They said, well, if you don't pay up, we're going to come over and do a sheriff's sale. And Griffin laughed at them, but they showed up a couple of months later in the dead of night, and they penned up 34 breeding rams and then crammed these animals into rowboats and canoes, which naturally woke up Griffin. He was extremely upset, especially after they all pulled pistols on him, and complained to the governor. The governor complained to the United States officials and went all the way up to the desk of the President of the United States. And he directed the Secretary of State, William Marcy, to issue a letter directing American officials not to interfere with the Hudson's Bay Company on San Juan Island. They were not saying that the islands belonged to Great Britain. They only wanted US officials to understand they were not to interfere. And of course, every British official had a copy of this letter from the Secretary of State in his vest pocket. And every time the Americans got a little fractious, he'd pull it out. So this particular incident finally got the United States Congress to appropriate the money for a joint boundary survey. This painting was done by William McMurtry, who was a illustrator and painter for the United States Coast Survey. He was aboard the United States Coast Survey steamer Active. She was 170 feet long, a side wheeler under the command of Captain James Alden, who incidentally was a direct descendant of John Alden and Priscilla Mullins of Mayflower fame. And their joint survey was HMS Satellite, a 21-gun steam corvette of the Royal Navy under the command of James Prevost. And they surveying the San Juan starting at the tail end of 1857. And the survey was going on right about the time of the Pig War incident. Incidentally, Prevost and Alden and the gentleman that Alden was working for, the United States Boundary Commissioner, Archibald Campbell, never did agree on which channel was the proper channel. All of this activity made the islands a little safer place to be. The islands used to be a convenient stopping off point for some of the Northwest Coast groups, among them the Tlingit, the Lekwitok, the Haida. They would raid up Puget Sound. Those of you who are part of Fort Steilacoom are certainly aware of this particular history. And once you had all of this activity going on in the archipelago, squatters or people looking for farm plots thought the island might be a pretty great place to come. And of course, because of glacial activity, there were many open areas, many prairies on the island. And so the Americans started crowding in on the Hudson's Bay Company sheep runs. Now, by 1859, the Hudson's Bay's Company's flocks had grown from 1,369 head all the way up to 4,500 head. And so there was a restriction process going on and a lot of tension building and a lot of complaints. There are actually surveyors that were surveying plots for American settlers which was deeply upsetting to the Hudson's Bay Company because they felt that the island was their one vast plantation. I'm gonna take a sip of water here. So here's what Griffin writes. There are now upwards of 16 squatters who have recently come and established themselves on various parts of the island, all claiming to be citizens of the United States, and they have one and all taken up claims and making improvements, a log cabin and a potato patch, that was probably Lyman Cutler, on the most valuable prairies I have in possession of my herdsmen and stock. Oh my. Well, it all came to a head 2 days from now, June 15th, 1859. Lyman Cutler caught this Berkshire boar rooting in his potato patch. He had warned Charles Griffin about the animal running loose and shot it. Now, a colleague of mine here on the island, historian, a guy named Boyd Pratt, Boyd believes that Cutler had a First Nations wife and accustomed to doing boundaries for camas patches. So Boyd believes it was raised earth, and that allowed the pig to cross over. I can't hear you. Okay, so he shoots the hog. Cutler immediately panics because he had chased the hog off his property onto the periphery of the woodland. So he's shot livestock, somebody else's animal on the frontier. Not a good thing to do. He goes down to Charles Griffin to make restitution. He says to Griffin, I'm sorry, I shot your pig. I'd be willing to make restitution. Griffin says that pig was a valuable animal and it's going to cost you $100. And Cutler said later in a deposition at the Whatcom County Superior Court, this was taken in September, Cutler said, I told him that I wouldn't pay $100 for a pig that weren't worth 10. Now, this has become over the years, it was a prize-winning boar. Well, there were no prizes being handed out in 1859. And that Cutler offered him $10 for the pig. Well, he didn't. He said the pig weren't worth 10. Who even knows if that's what he offered him for the pig? But we do know that Griffin wanted him to pay up $100, hoping to make him leave the island. Well, this guy, this is Alexander Grant Dallas. I call him Mr. Happy. He was a governor of the Hudson's Bay Company, happened to be the son-in-law of James Douglas, married James Douglas's eldest daughter. He had been sent out by the Hudson's Bay Company to help Douglas solve a few problems. There were revenue problems and numerous other things going on. He was out there to sort of straighten things out and happened to be there when this happened. And so Dallas and the governor put their heads together and decided the best thing to do would be send a magistrate over to San Juan Island and arrest Cutler and evict as trespassers all 18 Americans by then living on the island. DeCourcy was dispatched on July 27th aboard HMS Satellite. Now, DeCourcy was a Crimean War veteran. He had been part of an irregular force. He was with irregular cavalry called Bashi Bazooks in the sort of like a Lawrence of Arabia kind of thing. And when he was an Irish peer. He was eventually the Duke of Kinsale. He came to Vancouver Island. His first job was with the police court. He wasn't a very popular guy because he was leveling really harsh sentences. So Douglas sends him over here to arrest Cutler and evict all the Americans as trespassers. While Dallas was complaining to Douglas, the United States Army's Department of Oregon Commander Brigadier General William S. Harney stopped off at San Juan. It was early July, and he was on an inspection tour of U.S. Army posts in the area. several US citizens approached and asked the Army for protection from Indian raids. Harney suggested they draft a petition. Now, this petition is kind of interesting. The petition doesn't say anything about the British at all. It doesn't say anything about Lyman Cutler being threatened with arrest. It asks for protection from raids by Northern Indians. That would be Northwest Coast groups who had come to the island. A couple of guys that had their heads cut off a few months earlier. I think once they saw an Army general, they were more concerned with getting that taken care of than anything else. Harney, on the other hand, when he got back, his orders were of an entirely different tenor to Captain George E. Pickett, who was the commander of Fort Bellingham, about 20 airline miles away on Bellingham Bay. Pickett was an 1846 West Point graduate. He was a Mexican War veteran, 34 years old. He was a Southerner, of course, from Virginia. The photograph that you're looking at was taken shortly after he was promoted to Major General in the Confederate Army. I use this photo. There's a picture of him in a US Army uniform, but it was taken when he was 21 years old. This was taken only a couple of years after the Pig War incident. It's probably what he looked like when he was here. Just have to ignore the gray uniform. Folks in Bellingham couldn't ignore the gray uniform. There was a bridge named after him in Bellingham, and the Bellingham City Council decided that that they could not have a bridge named after a guy that fought to maintain the institution of slavery in the American Civil War. So the bridge was renamed. Okay, so Pickett is told to abandon his post at Fort Bellingham and establish a new post on San Juan Island. He is to not allow the British to assume jurisdiction over American citizens. And he is to protect American citizens from the incursions of raiders from the north, that is, Northwest Coast Indian raids. So he lands, and this is an actual wash watercolor that was done by a British midshipman aboard HMS Satellite. Now, this is the ship that comes into Bellingham Bay with the magistrate de Courcy. De Courcy is to arrest Cutler and evict the Americans as trespassers. They come into the bay. The watercolor is dated July 27th, 1859. So you're seeing the longboat here approaching the beach. Here is Pickett's camp right on the beach. Now, he had been told to put his camp in a secure location. And now in the mid 19th century, that would be out of the range of naval guns. So that would be up here on the heights, not down on the beach where he could be raked. But there he is, right on the beach. This is the lighthouse tender Shoebrake. On board at this very instant is the U.S. Boundary Commissioner, Archibald Campbell, who didn't have a clue of what was going on. And of course, the British never believed that. They believed that he was in collusion with Pickett, which wasn't true. Here's the Hudson's Bay Company dock. We saw that in the map earlier. The bluff, incidentally, this bluff right here, HMS Tribune, was going through gun drills and actually wet fire and was firing solid shot away from Pickett's camp, I think to probably intimidate Pickett. Two high school boys in the early 2000s found a solid shot right about where I have these mistakes, these blue lines. And the boys were trying to take the solid shot home, and thank goodness our law enforcement rangers spotted them, and it's the only solid shot. We have like 8 of them in the park collection, and it's the only one that we have provenance on. And undoubtedly an 8-inch shot from the Tribune. So Pickett escalates the crisis by posting a proclamation, the third proviso of which reads, "This being United States territory, no laws other than those of the United States nor courts, except as are held by virtue of said laws, will be recognized or allowed on this island." Now, Pickett in no way was authorized to post such a thing. Nobody gave him any orders to post such a thing, and that immediately escalated the crisis. And of course, the British responded by sending HMS Tribune, 31-gun steam frigate, along with HMS Satellite, and then the survey vessel Plumper, 12 guns, 62 total now, pointed at his camp, which somewhat dampened Pickett's martial ardor. So this is the deck of HMS Satellite, and those are 8-inch naval guns. And there is some of the solid shot. So on reading Pickett's petition, alarmed Douglas dispatches Captain Jeffrey Phipps Hornby and HMS Tribune, a 31-gun steam frigate. Hornby was directed to order Pickett off the island, and if he did not leave, to use force if necessary. When the Royal Navy's senior officer in Esquimalt, Captain Michael de Courcy, a distant cousin of John, learned of Douglas's orders, he told the governor that the natives' standing policy on Pacific Station was to show the flag and only fire if fired upon. Hornby's orders were changed. Instead of resorting to force, he was to land an equal number of Royal Marines to the US soldiers, thereby establishing parity on the island. The message was immediately sent. So Hornby, here we have Hornby, eventually becomes an admiral of a fleet, just like his father. Hornby goes onto the island, and Captain Prevost of the Satellite and Captain Richards of the Plumper go with him, 3 naval captains, and they immediately tell Pickett he's got to leave. They don't say anything about landing equal numbers of Royal Marines till the end of the conversation. Pickett's stubborn. He says, "No, I can't leave. I'm here on the orders of my government," blah, blah, blah. And finally, Hornby presents the whole idea of landing an equal number of Royal Marines. Pickett says, "No, I can't allow you to do that. If you do that, I cannot be responsible for any evil that ensues." Evil meaning warfare, fisticuffs, fire. So Pickett asked Hornby to go back to his ship and send him a copy of the conversation, copy it down. Hornby's glad to do that. Pickett, meanwhile, sends a dispatch to Harney at Fort Vancouver, the essence of which was "help," and asks for reinforcements. Pickett's missives to Harney, which were received by Alfred Pleasanton, who was Harney's adjutant, they were somewhat panicky, a mix of panic and bravado is what I like to say. This is Captain Alden, the skipper of Alden had been, of course, surveying up in the islands since 1853. This is 6 years. He knows Douglas really well. He's had broken bread with him and everything else. He decides to go visit Douglas to make peace. And so he goes over there, and this is how he records the conversation. It's kind of florid. I asked Douglas what Captain Hornby's orders were, and if he was ordered to land, why didn't he? In reply to this, the governor said that if the magistrate called upon Captain Hornby for assistance in proper execution of the laws, he would land. Then, said I, there must be a collision, for Captain Pickett will not permit it. What, said His Excellency? Captain Pickett has only about 50 men. Would he fire upon 600? Yes, said I. 6,000. Oh, said Captain Richards, who was present, that would be madness. So Alden says, call it anything you like, madness or anything else. Captain Pickett has made up his mind to it, and I pledge you upon my honor he will, if he should be, to use a rather inelegant expression, but one very much to the point, wiped out the next moment. So, oh, that's a lot of drama. So, okay, so here you go, Fort Steilacoom, folks. The reinforcements are called 100 miles from up 100 miles of Puget Sound under the command of 9th Infantry Regiment Deputy Commander Lieutenant Colonel Silas Casey. Casey takes command of all the U.S. forces on the island, and several days later welcome more troops plus 8 32-pounder naval guns from the USS Massachusetts. Each gun had an effective range of about 1.5 miles. This represented a serious escalation of the crisis, as Captain Hornby had been ordered not to allow U.S. reinforcements to land or for fortifications to be built. And of course, when Casey comes up to the island, he also brings up all of these Sibley tents, and they are erected. Pickett, meanwhile, had moved his camp from the Griffin Bay side over to the South Beach side on the Strait of Juan de Fuca. And Captain Hornby wrote an interesting letter. Let's go back to him. He writes his wife, and he says, I don't understand this Captain Pickett at all. First, he puts his camp in an exposed location. All I need to do is rake him with my guns. And then he pulls up, he moves to the opposite side of the island, to the opposite beach. All I need to do is weigh anchor, steam around the point, and shell him for there. Well, what Hornby didn't know was that George Pickett, yes, here he is, graduated last in his class at West Point. But he did get high marks in French. So Henry Martin Robert fortifies the high ground, and he comes with a 10-man sapper team from Fort Steilacoom. The guns were to be in place on the high ground overlooking both the Strait of Juan de Fuca and Griffin Bay. With the prospect of vulnerability to plunging fire, Captain Hornby asked his superior, Rear Admiral R. Lambert Baines, recently returned from Valparaiso, if he should attack. Incidentally, this is the same guy that wrote Robert's Rules of Order. Baines's reply is, tut, tut, no, no, the damn fools. The admiral was aware of the delicate nature of U.S.-British relations. While the U.S. frowned on empire, the British were displeased with Yankee expansion in the far west and the arrogance of the Monroe Doctrine. But the nations were enjoying a burgeoning economic partnership. Trade had never been better, and the British were already heavily invested in U.S. business. A war over a 54-square-mile island would be nothing short of disastrous. He ordered Hornby to stand by and only fire if fired upon. A diplomatic solution was certain to come. And so Casey moves his camp. There's a couple of storms at South Beach. Pretty soon, the reinforcements number 461 soldiers. I mean, they practically emptied Fort Steilacoom, plus other units from Fort Vancouver onto the island. And they were all dressed in the dress uniform of the period, with the Hardy hat and the frock coat and the whole thing. Here they are with a Napoleon gun at American camp. Diplomatic solution met when word went to Washington. It took 6 weeks for word to reach anyone. It had to go by way of the Isthmus of Panama. You take a steamer to San Francisco on to Panama City. You take the train, the Panama Railroad across the isthmus, and then from there up the coast. You could also send a dispatch over the overland stage. Took about the same time. So a messenger was sent by steamer, and the telegraph that went by way of the overland stage and then from the keyboard at Fort Leavenworth, the telegraph got there about 24 hours ahead. And this is the British minister plenipotentiary. We did not exchange ambassadors with Great Britain until the 1890s. So here we have him. He meets with the Secretary of State, and they agree that Winfield Scott will carry dispatches for the British and will serve as a negotiator for the Americans and negotiate a stand down for a peaceful resolution. Now, Scott was 72 years old, 6'5", 385 pounds. He had gout. He had the dropsy, meaning that he could fall asleep at any moment. And he had also broken his collarbone. And so he had to be put in a basket and derricked onto every vessel on the way out here. It's quite a journey for a man of his condition to take, which should underscore just how important it was for the United States and Great Britain to resolve this sticky problem. Following a 6-week passage, Scott stopped first at Fort Vancouver and yanked Harney and Pickett, who was there on court-martial duty, into his shipboard cabin and scolded them for their quote-unquote little conquest. He then embarks for Port Townsend, where he transferred aboard the USS Massachusetts and begins to negotiate with Governor Douglas. It took them about a week. They agreed to a stand down. They didn't quite agree to a joint occupation, but that was agreed to unbeknownst to them by the two governments, who agreed on a joint military occupation of the island, believing that if there were military in place, that no civilian fracas could escalate, which would then require military or naval forces to be drawn in. So in the meantime, Douglas, so they've settled it. He says, you'll smile with this, and no doubt with a reason too, but the words stand recorded nevertheless. These people, boy, the parenthetical phrases. Essentially, what this long, wordy sentence says is that the governor doesn't want Pickett to be the first officer on the island, being of somewhat hasty temperament and somewhat punctilious and exacting. So poor old George Pickett sent back to Fort Bellingham, and this guy takes over, Captain Lewis Cass Hunt, another Fort Steilacoom guy, who shared with Pickett a remarkable distinction. They graduated last or close to the bottom of their West Point classes in successive years. Now, Hunt runs afoul of Harney. He wrote poison pen newspaper articles about him. And one, he referred to him as a wretched, stupid, old goose. So American Camp was established here. This was American Camp. In fact, these two buildings are actually on the site. This one never left the site. The one on the very far left, the one next to it, we moved in December 2010 from town. A lot of the buildings after the joint occupation were auctioned off. So that began a joint military occupation. 8 companies or batteries from 4 regiments, all regular Army, were eventually assigned under 15 different officers over the next 12 years, sort of rotating back and forth from Fort Steilacoom. Through it all, the commanders took advantage of the Hudson's Bay Company's sheep run, improving it into a military road that, before a telegraph was installed along its track in the mid-1860s, permitted rapid transit by horse and mule power. And this is actually a map that was drawn by the first British commander, George Basil Jett. You can see American Camp down here, the American reservation, and English Camp, a wedge out of the northern end of the island. The British established their camp in March 1860, 13 miles north of Camp Pickett. And then Harney replaced Hunt with Pickett in April, declared that he did not recognize the joint military occupation, which got him in a heck of a lot of hot water. And that resulted in finally his being relieved of duty here. And then, of course, in the Army's brilliant golden parachute fashion, they made him commander of the Department of the West, based in St. Louis, a much bigger department. And that was the end of Harney here. And of course, they settled into the 12-year peaceful joint occupation of San Juan Island. The two first commanders, Pickett, the two Georges, Pickett and Basil Jett. Basil Jett was a veteran of the Crimean War and the Second Opium War. And the Royal Marines were from a contingent of supernumerary Marines, 134 that had been brought over by the Tribune from China in 1858, the very tail end of the year. And this duty was looked upon as pretty good duty for the Royal Marines. The joint occupation was characterized by liquor sellers. The island was essentially lawless. I mean, it was in dispute, so the laws of none of the country's laws applied. British civil law they did not attempt to enforce British civil law here at all over the 12-year joint occupation. The Americans, on the other hand, tried to force the issue, tried to overrule the army, which created numerous conflicts and actually resulted in some Americans being evicted from the island. This was American camp. This particular map was a copy done by Pickett's second command, James Forsyth. It was the map, the original map was done by Captain Tom Casey, who was Silas Casey's son. Thomas Casey actually went on to finish the Washington Monument after the American Civil War. He was an engineering officer and then supervised the construction of the Library of Congress, but did this map. Of course, there were a lot of complaints about the inattention of the War Department of the detachment on San Juan Island. The men went actually at one point 6 months without being paid, which kind of hurt because the Royal Marines not only got their regular pay, they were paid through the British ships in Esquimalt, usually the senior officer's ship, and they got colonial pay on top of that. There was quite a bit of bad blood. Okay, so the boundary concerns faded in 1860 when Abraham Lincoln was elected. With every scrap of bleak news of the nation's unraveling arrived by steamer or pony express, paranoia abounded in the Department of Pacific headquarters over suspected bands of secessionists hell-bent on turning the Pacific states and territories to the south of creating long-held chimera of an independent republic of the Pacific. The unease was felt among U.S. troops. In fact, the Bishop George Hill, the Anglican bishop from Victoria, reported great excitement and also a heated argument between this man, Lieutenant James Forsyth, Pickett's second in command, and Pickett over Lincoln's election and the subsequent secession of 7 southern states. San Juan was originally ordered closed because of these consolidation measures that were going on throughout the Department of the Pacific, which the military structure, command structure, I won't go into it in detail now, I'm probably over time as it is, but changed several times over the years. But the George Wright, who was the commander, wanted it closed, and then George Pickett and others wrote saying you can't close it. It's a salient commanding position of our northern frontier, admirably adapted to afford general protection to the settlement on the waters of Puget Sound. And so the request was granted. San Juan Island was maintained, and then Pickett resigned. As I write in the book, suddenly the very man who complained about closing his salient commanding position was now abandoning it with the barely veiled intent of joining the enemy. And of course, Pickett was still a captain in the U.S. Army on July 21st, serving at San Juan Island when the Battle of Bull Run was fought. As many of you know, there was no clear policy issued by the Secretary of War addressing resignations of Southern officers who were breaking their oaths to the United States. Pickett applied for an official leave of absence. He was one of the guys that they allowed to go. Some officers in Washington Territory were dismissed. If you want to read more about that, go to my History Link article about Southern officers on the eve of the Civil War. Pickett was lucky. And even though everybody knew who he was, he traveled under the name of Edward Eldridge, who was a Bellingham pioneer. As everyone knows, Silas Casey ended up in a training capacity, but before that happened, he ended up contending with George Pickett at the Battle of Gaines Mill over a redoubt of all things. Meanwhile, Pickett's second in command, James Forsyth, found a home. I say here, Major General John Porter, this is a mistake. This is an old slide presentation. It was actually Andrew Porter. And one of his fellow aides was this man, George Custer. These two had careers that were intertwined. Pickett, of course, the Battle of Gettysburg. At Gettysburg, three of the officers who had some connection with Pickett on San Juan Island were also involved in that battle. Alfred Pleasanton in charge of the cavalry, Union cavalry. Rufus Ingalls, who was in charge of the Army of Potomac supplies, and Henry Hunt, the brother of Lewis Cass, who was in charge of the artillery. Of course, Forsyth would later impact Pickett's Confederate unit at the Battle of Five Forks, leading a portion of the Union line, which caused Pickett's army to collapse. But one thing before I leave is there are several post-Bellum accounts of what the British called the San Juan difficulty, speculating that Harney, a Tennessean, and Pickett aimed to start a war with Great Britain in hopes it would unite North and South and prevent civil war. The main sources of this story were Pickett's 50-year-old widow, Sally Corbell Pickett, and Major General George B. McClellan, Pickett's West Point classmate. Granville Haller, who as a U.S. Army captain was involved in the standoff, countered these revelations in 1896. In his version, Pickett and Harney meant to start a war, but with the far darker motive of distracting the North so the South could achieve independence. Now, I want to stress that no records exist in either official or private correspondence to validate either one of these theories. Absolute hogwash. And Sally Corbell, a noted prevaricator, and of course, George McClellan, he had an active imagination, as anyone who's read about the Civil War knows. Okay, so the joint occupation goes on for 12 years. Finally, the Treaty of Washington is signed in 1871. And the Treaty of Washington stipulates that a commission will be created, a three-man commission from Imperial Germany. They would meet for a year in Geneva. Both nations, Great Britain and the United States, would submit arguments and counter arguments, and then the commission would rule and the Kaiser would issue his decision. So the decision was issued on October 21st, 1872, and it was 2-1. The commissioner, Ferdinand Grimm, pointed out that the Haro Strait touches Vancouver Island. The Rosario Strait does not. It was truly in most accordance with the true interpretation of the treaty, and the judgment was endorsed, and that was that. So the Royal Marines depart. On Monday, November 18th, HMS Skagit, under the command of the senior naval officer, Captain R.B. Cater, arrives in Garrison Bay to withdraw the garrisons and its stores. And by November 22nd, all of the Royal Marines are gone. And the Americans rush up to run an enormous American garrison flag up the 80-foot pole at English camp. But when they got there, they discovered that the pole had been chopped down. And so this scene was recreated by our volunteers. We used to have an event every year called Encampment. And we had people from British Columbia and the United States, including Karen and Patrick, who you all know, Karen and Patrick Hawes. And the British government in 1998 appropriated $12,000, 7,000 pounds to buy a new fiberglass pole to replace the one that we'd lost the year before. So the British government at last replaced the pole, and we had a huge celebration. And Karen and Patrick were actually there for that, the first encampment in August of 1998. And so here is the park's creation. This was the dedication at English Camp in 1972. Park was created in 1966 to commemorate the peaceful resolution of conflict. Now, we share a boundary with Canada that's the longest unfortified border in the world. It's the longest unfortified border in the history of the world, which is a fitting tribute to the peace that was maintained in that summer of 1859 and all of the years thereafter. So you see, individuals and nations can sometimes resolve their problems peacefully without resorting to violence. And I thank you.
Mr. Vouri, thank you very much for that presentation today. I know I speak for everyone that attended in saying that we have very much enjoyed it and appreciate your words. I did want to open it up for questions at this time. So if anyone would like to ask Mr. Vouri a question, you can take yourself off mute. You may also take yourself, start sharing your video again. But please, if anyone has any questions, you can do so at this time.
That was sort of the peppermint twist.
Hey, Mike, if I could drop a little line here, I want to bring back something that goes way back a ways. I've got this little book here I picked up a number of years ago from the park, and inside is actually in my book collection. I've got the newer version, but I found this little inscription in there from you almost 21 or 20 years ago this month.
Yeah.
This was to my wife and I for helping out at Lantern Tour back in June of 2001. It's been a while.
Well, it's really great to see you again, John.
Yeah.
Yeah, you were. John was part of that contingent that came to encampment every year.
Well, it's good to see you too, Mike. Again, it's great. I got to have you speak, and I'm good to hear your voice again.
Yeah, thank you. It's really wonderful to see you.
Excellent. Well, you know, if there are no further questions, I wanted to point out that our president, Walter Neary, did post a message in the chat applauding this wonderful presentation that we've heard, and also just restating that we're grateful for our members who support the maintenance and restoration of the 4 remaining buildings from the Pig War era and the fort's other programming. You can go to historicfortstillicum.org/membership to become a member if you want to support our association. Finally, Mike, again, thank you very much for agreeing to do this presentation. We really enjoyed it, and I hope that we will be able to see you visit Fort Steilacoom sometime in the future. You're always invited.
Did you see there was somebody from Nottingham, England with us today?
That's fabulous. I didn't see that. But
Yeah.
we did have up
Lovely.
to 31 participants, which was
Excellent.
fantastic.
Great. Well, I hope to see you all again real soon. And thanks everyone for your kind attention.
Thank you.